After Crawford's impressive win against Canelo at super middleweight, there's now calls for him to fight Dmitry Bivol. The Russian going down to 168 pounds or Crawford's move to light heavyweight appears unlikely, but the matchup would embody the differing boxing doctrines, Soviet efficiency against Western flair. So let's examine how the Soviet and Western boxing schools developed to produce often contrasting fighters, before analysing the outcome when two practitioners from each have faced off in the past. Now, I love exploring boxing culture in countries and have therefore created a retro Cuban boxing t-shirt. Hopefully the first of many from around the world, but we'll see how we go. If you are somewhat interested and want to support my project, please consider purchasing one. I'd greatly appreciate it. The Shopify link is down below. Thank you, you legends. So why does each side box? Is it for entertainment, profits, glory, or international prestige? Well, the Soviet motivations largely contrast that of the West. Studies show that in both Cuba and the Soviet Union, athletic superiority was a political goal, implying that Olympic success proved that communism was the better ideology. With both Cuba and the Soviets featuring heavily in the Olympic boxing medal tally, you can understand the importance placed upon boxing as a sign of glory and international prestige, proof of mental and physical supremacy. Contrary to this transactional approach, the West strays towards the entertainment side, with the professional circuits garnering the headlines and funding. For example, AJ Liebling's The Sweet Science lamented television's influence as causing profits to be prioritised over fighters' development. Yet I'd still argue many viewed the sport as an art form and would pay to watch it. With the Soviets obsessed with measurable success and the West seeking to milk the noble arts for profit, the demeanour of fighters has been diametrically opposed from each side. Professional bouts rely heavily on money generated from pay-per-view and ticket sales, making selling through trash talk and flashy styles paramount.
See you, I'm gonna beat you in your mama's ass.
This man will be completely outboxed.
You got time. You got time.
This will be no contest. That's all I want to say.
All right, what do you say, Joe? What do you say to that?
The Soviets' attitude was, and still is, based upon a cold, calculated approach. Boxers don't tend to sell amateur or Olympic bouts. They simply turn up, outscore the opponent, and hopefully leave with a gold medal.
Of course, emotions is like spices for your life, but when you have some hard situation, you shouldn't use your emotions.
As historian Paula Jean cites, the Soviets produced athletes and personnel who are followers, rewarded for their discipline and obedience. Achieve, and the state will provide fancy cars, expensive meals, and better housing. In the West, status was gained through wealth. In the East, it was garnered through prestige. But what about the actual styles? Well, the Soviet one was rooted in science. Born and Todd states the Soviet sport performance research far excelled that of the West. Take Filomenov's studies on punching power, where he uncovered that the use of legs when pushing off was responsible for boxers producing 38.46% of the power of the punch. Trunk rotation, meanwhile, was the second greatest at 37.42%. The style therefore involves the pendulum step and rotation of the hips to generate force while the arms flow. Soviet training includes medicine ball rebounder exercises and landmine presses to refine this movement, a highly methodical approach. So what about the West?
Blue, I can finger rainbow, finger rainbow, finger rainbow too.
What do you think that does for you?
Self-confidence.
Look, you're looking down there. What do you think that does for you?
Self-confidence.
Gives you confidence.
Like Brendan Ingle once said, though the styles across Western boxing gyms are diverse, they often rely on confidence, conviction, and essentially vibes. The pro circuit is brutal, with newspapers, fans, and media outlets branding boxers with all kinds of criticism, so confidence has always been key, which of course can be reflected in many of the styles. Philly shell, peekaboo, Ingle's hands down approach, the Western methods seem more daring and poetic. pragmatic. They are designed to entertain crowds and accrue profit, as opposed to guaranteeing Olympic glory. The freedom of the Western styles is further underlined by how talent is nurtured. Since the mid-20th century, Western nations have strayed away from boxing as a compulsory endeavour. Instead, children voluntarily enter it, often to escape poverty, trouble, or simply as a means of expression. The Soviet system, meanwhile, has always been more targeted. Yuri Brokhin's The Big Red Machine notes the morphological technique which was and still is used to select young athletes according to biological maturity instead of age. This helps zero in on the sports for which a child is best suited. For example, those with broad shoulders, thick necks, and overly long limbs are siphoned off into the boxing circuit. This is obviously apparent in both old training footage as well as amongst modern Russian fighters like Bivol and Beterbiev. The boxers are scientifically backed before the gloves are even laced. But in the West, there's a different system. Take Prince Nassim's discovery.
The bus stops, some cars in front of the bus stop. I'm on the top deck. I just happened to look in and I see this little kid who he looked like a Pakistani to me. He just become above the wall. There's some railings and there's three kids punching at him, and he's ducking in and out and hitting them. Only probably about, I'd say, 5 or 6 seconds. And I thought to myself, bloody hell, he can move.
Unlike the physical attributes of Soviet beginners, unique traits like speed, flexibility, or toughness normally identified Western boxers as major prospects. Hence, the Western boxing philosophy seems to be more flexible. In line with free thinking, and in contrast to communist dogma, the styles vary in the West, while Soviet training camps often showcase practically identical robots. As evidenced in the Eastern Bloc states, boxing was imposed on children through the curriculum, creating a factory-like compulsory system churning out pugilists. Yet the West uses intuition, focusing more on individuality, while building upon original and useful traits, both beautiful in their own way, though ultimately reflecting the political principles of each region. However, it wasn't simply the physical side which was dictated by science in the Soviet corner. Russian sports psychologist Avksenty Tsarevich Puny was simply leaps and bounds ahead of the Americans. Puny focused on individualization, believing that athletes who were mentally dependent on their coaches would be ill-prepared for high-level competitions where they would be required to make quick and effective decisions independently. This method was heavily followed at both the 1976 Montreal and 1980 Moscow Olympic Games, and the adaptability paid dividends. The country won 1 gold, 7 silvers and 5 bronzes, granted they were helped by the US boycott in 1980. The Western scene has seen a more considerable reliance on coaches, with the majority of all-time greats being wedded to a famous learned trainer whom they would regularly rely upon. Boxing writer Sam Toporov described the Sugar Ray Leonard and Roberto Duran first matchup as a game of checkers, not between fighters but the trainers. He wrote, "Angelo Dundee knew that, strategically speaking, he was up against the best there was in the odd couple of Arcel and Brown, implying that those in the corner dictated how the fight would play out and the actions of their fighter. But remember, these fights would last 15 and later 12 rounds in the Western pro circuit. Olympic bouts were just 3. Yet throughout the course of winning an Olympic medal, you fight 5 times, meaning 15 rounds in total. Consequently, Soviet practitioners needed to be flexible, facing many different opponents and challenges, while Westerners focused on besting one singular opposition over a drawn-out period. I feel modern-day Soviet-schooled boxers like Bivol and Beterbiev have retained this adaptability imposed by Puny and brought it to the pro ranks. So having explored the scientific approach of those schooled by Soviet psychology, alongside the free-flowing artistry of Western thought, how exactly have the matchups gone? In November 2014, the Soviet stylist Sergei Kovalev met the defensive master Bernard Hopkins. Though not the flashiest, Hopkins was great technically, deploying the Philly shell and rolls to set up traps and counters. With the American being 49 and past his best, Kovalev would put on a boxing clinic, pendulum stepping in and out while picking Hopkins off with straight shots. A win for the Soviet style, But now let's go to the amateurs. At the 1988 Olympics in Seoul, America's Andrew Maynard met Russia's Nurmagomedov Shanavazov in the light heavyweight final. Shanavazov was an experienced Soviet practitioner, while Maynard had only started boxing 2 years earlier. What would unfold would be a Western boxing masterclass as Maynard slipped, ducked and rolled under the relentless straight 1-2s of the Russian. Deploying peekaboo-style movements to shift off the centre line, Maynard was mesmerising, drawing Shanavazov in close, deploying exceptional hand speed and level changes to unsettle and dominate. Both pugilists gave their all, yet the natural talent of Maynard won him the gold. 22 years later, the Soviet-trained Dmitry Pirog would clash with America's Daniel Jacobs in a bitter back-and-forth duel, with each boxer delivering stinging body shots, attempting to unlock the guard and fire to the head. The rounds gradually wore on. Pirog's defensive skills were exceptional, almost Western-like in their application, and he would set traps constantly. In round 6, the Russian began to trap Jacobs against the ropes, eventually deploying the switch step to get in close and land a chopping right onto the American's chin. With Jacobs' left shoulder cocked in preparation for the Philly shell, the knockout symbolised the danger of flashiness when confronted by science-like efficiency. Kostya Tsu was an iconic Soviet fighter who would bring much of the science to Australia in the 1990s. But aside from his eventual loss to Ricky Hatton in June 2005, he'd only have one major blip in his career. When taking on America's Vince Phillips in May 1997, he'd succumb to strong head movement combined with a slugging style. Phillips would use level changes, lunging hooks and straight shots to match Tsu's technical skills. Sadly, though the Soviet style is perfect for point scoring, it can leave its practitioners vulnerable when the opponent throws powerful straight shots with their head off the center line. The fight would eventually be stopped in Phillips's favor. And now we have the archetype of the Soviet style, in a modern context at least, Dmitry Bivol. In November 2018, Bivol took on Canada's Jean Pascal, who largely epitomized the slick, defensively savvy notion associated with Western boxing. Bivol would show incredible speed, distance management and ring IQ, toying with the Canadian and his hands-down approach. This matchup symbolized the West and East dichotomy, as Pascal sought to entertain and taunt the Russian while Bivol silently and professionally dismantled. The combinations were mesmeric, and the Canadian just couldn't close the gap, leaving him completely outclassed and outpointed. Many of the best Soviet practitioners from the 1980s and 90s, including Alexander Yagubkin and Alexander Lebziak, never committed to the pro ranks even after the collapse of the Soviet Union. This has left the style, in my view, slightly underappreciated and left doubt upon its efficacy against the very best professionals. However, Dmitry Bivol has not only popularized the technique, but also showcased how incredibly successful it can be when applied properly. Despite its simplicity, often revolving around simple 1-2s, it can carry individuals to world titles. But now I'd like to hear what you guys have to say. Is the Soviet style the greatest one out there? Will we see more Dmitry Bivols in the future? Perhaps Bakram Murtazaliev is next in line. Please let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. One thing we can all agree on is the general fluidity in the style's movements. It's quite beautiful to watch. If you guys would like to support the channel and myself, please consider buying a t-shirt linked down below. Buy it for your friend, family, that would honestly be amazing, thank you. Maybe I'll create a cool Soviet style one in the future, we'll have to wait and see. All the best guys, thank you for watching, cheers.